My name is Vipasna Nangal. I am an immigrant. I was an immigrant to Canada, but I guess citizenship-wise, I'm Canadian now. Um, yeah, I'm currently a university student at the University of Calgary. I'm studying political science, and I'm in my first year. I would probably refer to myself as Indian Canadian. My family comes originates from Punjab, and so that's sort of how I locate myself. Well, we're here because of my dad. It was in his university days when he decided to apply, and the process at that time used to take it was quite long and arduous. And so he was the one who had applied long before he had gotten married. And then afterwards, after I think when I was born, they heard back from the Canadian embassy, and this was after sort of he had like a government job in India, but he chose to come here, and he likes to cite the reason as being his children. I think for him it was really important that we grow up in a space that would be welcoming and diverse, and so that was the primary reason that we moved. So we actually came here twice. The first time we went to Ontario, Mississauga. And so we moved there the first time when I was around 3, and we came back. That was sort of like a trial and error process. They wanted to see how things were in Canada, and then we went back to Canada when I was around 5 with my little sister. In terms of experiences, they like to say that it was like, if you talk to my dad, it's his favorite. His like immigrant stories are his favorite to cite. He will talk about how hard it was, and it genuinely it was quite difficult because my dad was a veterinarian in India, and so he had to redo all of the tests and examinations to actually be certified. And so watching him sort of bring up his children during the day and study during the night, I think it takes a toll on that person, but I think it also affects those who sort of look towards him to support them. And so, yeah, I think a lot of my childhood was colored by his experiences. My dad, he's very, he likes, and he says this himself, he doesn't like hierarchies, like those scare him a lot. And so a huge reason as to why he wanted to move was because I think he saw Canada as being more egalitarian or imitating more of a meritocracy, the kind of system that he wanted to live in. Growing up in India, and I'm sure you're aware of like the reservation systems and the support that's available for a lot of Dalits in India. After he became a veterinarian, a lot of people would sort of cite the social systems that supported him as a way of delegitimizing how hard he had to work. And as a man, sort of seeing that I think it took a toll on him. And so I think that he didn't want his children to grow up in the same way. He wanted our success to be ours. My parents sort of grew up very close to the caste system. I think my sister and I, and my brother too, I think we sort of live in our little bubble. We have the luxury of choosing to ignore it when we want to, and then choosing to come to terms with it when we want to. But for my dad, it was sort of ever present. And so he'll sort of reference very like offhandedly these experiences that he had with educators. You know, in India, when it comes to sort of claiming like the reservation or using it, you have to sort of raise your hand in classrooms and be like, I'm an SC or I'm a Dalit. So like, I need these programs. And so that was, I think that particularly took a toll on him. But even going farther back, I think he grew up sort of listening to his father and the stories that my grandfather had about not being able to sit with other students and being ostracized or being considered untouchable, and how that takes a toll, and how that takes a toll on how you choose to see yourself, right? It's hard to consider yourself human and consider yourself worthy when the way that you're being treated is so inhuman. And so this is something that my sister and I talk about a lot. Like a lot of our history has been riddled with how to figure out how to be human, how to sort of, how to be more than the little constraints that we've grown up in. And so that was a lot of what my dad did, I think, because, he grew up in India, he gained qualifications that he needed to, and then he came here and he had to do that process all over again. And so that's sort of, I guess, the theme in our family about learning how to live outside those constraints that have been put on you. Personally, coming back a little bit to me and my siblings, we're very lucky, I think, like I said before, to sort of choose to acknowledge the caste system or choose to acknowledge being Dalit when we want to, right? We get to come to terms with it on our own. So we choose to engage in those conversations, right? Like a lot of my peers, I guess I could choose to not engage with that thing, with that identity. It would be a little bit easier, but I think it would take away on my morals. But yeah, so personally speaking, it's caste is kind of like, it's in the background. It's like that thing that's in the room that nobody wants to talk about, but it colors so much of how you interact with the world, especially when I interact with students who are of Indian descent. I think it creates this sort of odd space because, you'll be in a classroom and you want to acknowledge or highlight the experiences of a specific marginalized group in India, but you see that conversation being shunned away or being delegitimized because students don't want to acknowledge it, or because they've grown up in homes that have held this narrative that this just doesn't exist anymore, or that untouchability is legislatively been removed, and so it's been socially removed as well. And so I think the experiences of my grandparents and my dad were figuring out how to be human, how to exist outside of those constraints. But for my siblings and I, or I guess for this next generation, it's about coming to terms on our own volition and choosing to sort of spin the narrative in a way that we want to reclaiming the word Dalit, but doing it in a way that we're comfortable and proud of it. It's like the explicit exclusion of caste in conversations with Indian Canadians that makes it so omnipresent. Like that, it's quite a dichotomy when you think about it, right? You would think that by not talking about something, you're removing it, but by actively choosing to not have it be a factor in conversations, you're actually making it a much stronger of a force. And I think that's really what it is. So like, going back to having conversations, let's say, about Indian politics, which is something that came up a lot, even in high school, right? The farmers' protest was another one that came up a lot, and it had sort of a caste dimension to it. If you really wanted it to, like, you could look there. There could be a whole nother research on that. But if I, as a Dalit student, would try to sort of raise that concern, I think it would get shunned, but not just shunned by educators. I think I'm very grateful that the teachers I had were quite open to those conversations, but it would get shunned by a lot of Indian Canadians living here. I think it was just something that they did not want to acknowledge. I think a perfect example of this was when I was in around grade 8 or 9, and our teacher was, I think she was from somewhere in Europe, and she was talking about how her partner was telling her about the untouchable system in India. And I was like, oh wow, for the first time I'm sort of seeing a conversation or a narrative of caste actually being brought up. And then just as I was about to say something, a student raised her hand, and she was like, oh, but that doesn't happen anymore. Like that's not something that happens. And in that moment, I realized that she's very, very lucky that it doesn't happen to her. But just because it doesn't happen to her, or because she's not sort of at the receiving end of that discrimination, doesn't mean it doesn't happen at all. And so I think that experience in itself quite encapsulates how those conversations go. Either they don't happen, or when they do, they're actively shunned or forgotten about. There's like some experiences that I think that come to mind more than others. this was actually quite interesting. So this is a specific experience that I had not that long ago. I think it was around grade 10, so maybe like 2 to 3 years ago. So a student, and I had never been asked this before, so it was quite weird to me. But a student who wasn't from India, he was from Afghanistan. He came up to me and he asked me what my caste was, and I was almost like a little shocked, but I thought it was so amusing because this is not a student who's aware of Indian history to my knowledge, and he was asking me about my caste, and I was like, "What do you know about the caste system?" And slowly we sort of had like this little group, and he started explaining it to me, and I thought that was so funny. I was like, I'm kind of getting a kick out of this. And one of the girls, she was sort of a mutual friend, I guess, of him and I's, and she sort of came into the conversation, and she started breaking down the caste system for me. And what she said was, there's people like us on the top, and then there's people who clean our shoes. And that was sort of the first time I think I had experienced someone use that derogatory of language to describe my entire lineage, like my entire history. And I'm somebody who's quite combative sometimes with my words when I shouldn't be. But it was so funny because I remember coming home and I was like, I didn't say anything to her because I was so shocked that somebody could actually be so abrasive with their words. And so that experience in itself, I think, really stands out. I'm grateful to not be, I'm grateful that I haven't been subjected to like systematic levels of discrimination where, discrimination is embedded into institutions, but there have been a lot of instances, I think, where there's been a lot of interpersonal interactions that have had very discriminatory undertones. Because I was like, I didn't know what I was supposed to look like. And so maybe in a way it sort of initiated a level of identity crisis because she referred to her and I to be in like the same category and same group. And I think that sort of reflected her own conception of what a Dalit is supposed to look like. And I think it definitely isn't supposed to look like a high school student who is her peer. And that's quite sad. And I think it sort of comes back to this idea of visibility, right? She hadn't seen a Dalit before, to my understanding, or at least she hadn't acknowledged one so close to her. And so her assumption of what one looks like was very entrenched in I want to say like a lot of not good images, a lot of stereotypes. It's so funny because I think in my personal life, I'm such an optimistic person, or at least I try to be. But when it comes to this topic specifically, my reactions when it comes to looking ahead and looking to the future are always so mixed. My biggest, I think, worry about caste as an identity is that when kids or when families move from India to Canada, they can choose to be Dalit. And what I mean by that is they don't have to associate with, for example, like the Guru Ravidas Society, right? Like my parents choose to be an active part of that association. They choose to go there. And in that way, they choose to sort of continue their association with the Dalit community. A huge trend, even within our community, has been, I'm going to move from India to Canada, and I'm just going to shed that part of myself. That's perhaps their way of being liberated. That's their liberation, to no longer actually have to come to terms with what it means to be a Dalit Canadian or to be Dalit in itself. And I guess my biggest worry is in order to resist something, you have to acknowledge it, right? And so if you can't have resistance without having visibility. And when you have like a lot of mass migration, but you have a portion of those individuals or families simply saying, we're just not going to associate with it, that's, I think, the worst case scenario, because if something isn't going to be present, then you can't deal with it. And that's something that I've seen among a lot of students. But on the other hand, I've also seen a lot of like work from scholars, and I've seen a lot of young people engaging in conversations, albeit a lot of students who aren't from my background. A lot of them who are actually more open to having discussions because maybe they don't have to carry the burden of that history. So my reactions about looking forward into the future are quite mixed. But I think I think being a descendant of any kind of social stratification, or being at least from a marginalized community, means that like undertone of fear will always be there. And that's just something that I guess we learn to live with.